Everybody, I'm Brian Julius. I'm the Chief Content Officer for Enterprise DNA, and welcome to Day 4 of the Enterprise DNA Reporting and Visualization Summit. I hope you've been enjoying the presentation so far and learning a lot, and we've still got 2 more days packed full of great presenters for you. So, to kick things off on Day 4, I wanted to talk today about advanced conditional formatting. And when I was selecting a topic for this summit, I thought a lot about what to present on, and I landed on conditional formatting for a couple of reasons. One of which is I had just done a session with our accelerator group, and we were focusing on conditional formatting. It really struck me in comparing the exercise, and I've got it up here left and right. And the only difference between these 2 pages is one has conditional formatting and one doesn't. And it just really stood out to me that conditional formatting just makes the conclusions and the patterns just kind of jump off the page. And the other thing about it is conditional formatting is, I think, relatively easy to learn. The basics are pretty straightforward, and the payoff is really high. But in thinking more about the specifics of conditional formatting, I had done a poll around the same time, and I've always been a believer that the field value option is kind of the secret weapon of conditional formatting. That, as I say here, DAX is a force multiplier for conditional formatting, and that the use of the field value opens the door to the full power of DAX. That you're not bound by just the form of the rules box or the color gradient, but you can basically take anything you can think of in terms of applying DAX logic to and turn that into a field value and then build that into your conditional formatting. And so I did a poll on this, and I was kind of surprised by what I found, which is that when you add up kind of which approach people use most often, only about 40% of the time did people say, 40% of the responders say they use field value the most frequently of the 3 options. And as I thought about that, I thought, boy, that's really giving away a lot of power in the use of conditional formatting. So I wanted to spend some time today focusing on some of the amazing things you can do with field value in conditional formatting. And so what I wanted to do was take 3 different applications of conditional formatting, all combining field value, DAX, and other techniques. And these are based on projects that I've worked on, forum responses that I've put together, and as well as just some reading and study that I've done. And so one of the things I really like is Oscar Martinez Valero has something on LinkedIn that he calls hashtag give credit for code. And it's just an attempt to recognize people upon whose code you're building. And I really like that, so I wanted to do that here. And I've got 3 examples that we're going to talk through. The first of which is dynamically determining the optimal font color for any background color. And this is really based on some amazing work that was done using color theory and hex tables. And it was originally developed by a mathematician named Ilmari Karonen in Finland. And then Ed Freeman of Power BI Weekly fame translated Ilmari's formulas into DAX. And you're going to see some crazy DAX that lets you do some amazing stuff with optimizing font color. The second thing is expansion of the conditional formatting icon sets. That if you use rules, you're limited pretty severely in terms of the icons you can use, which is a shame because there are tons of great icon sources. Free, pay. I typically use one called Flat Icon that I think has close to 4 million icons available for use. And so to limit yourself to just 2 or 3 dozen in the drop downs within the rules set seems really restrictive. So this is based on some work by Dhruvan Shah, and it's a really flexible way to expand your conditional formatting icon sets. I'm going to show you some neat tricks based on that. And then the third one is a really fun one that is one that I think I came up with on my own. I haven't seen anybody do this prior. And I posted it on LinkedIn. It was a way to hide and show visuals based on using hex code transparency masks. And it was a really cool example of how working in community is really beneficial, because there's a really sharp young developer named Pim Meesters, who I got to be friends with in the midst of this, who commented on what I posted and said, hey, it's a cool idea, but you lose the ability to do tooltips. And I thought about it, and I said, I think there's a way to do that. And then I posted it, and he said, well, here's an improvement on that. And then I said, okay, well, here's another improvement. And we kind of went back and forth, kind of ping-pong improvements, and came up with ultimately what I think is a really cool solution in terms of visual layering that I'm going to show you. So shout out to Pim on that one. So a couple of things before we get going. I want to talk very, very briefly about color theory, partly because I don't have a lot of time and partly because I don't know a lot about it. I know just enough to be dangerous. And the reason I want to talk about it is, as I said, you're going to see some pretty crazy DAX. And I've always said you don't ever want to use DAX that you don't understand. And in this case, there's not a huge downside, because the only thing that can go wrong is you can have black font rather than white font. But I'm fond of a quote that I heard from somewhere. I don't remember who said it, but it was that obviously wrong numbers are embarrassing, but subtly wrong numbers get you fired. And by using DAX you don't understand, I think that's where you end up with subtly wrong numbers. And in this case, as I say, the downside isn't that bad, but I think it's really important when you use DAX to understand what it's doing. And so I want to just talk through real briefly what this DAX is going to do. And it's based on hex codes, and hex codes are just a 6-character abbreviation for how much red, green, and blue light is exposed in the projection of a color. And you can convert hex codes directly to what are called RGB codes, red, green, blue. And so what you can do in terms of figuring out kind of how bright a color is to convert that hex code to an RGB, but you can't just average the values of the RGB to make a determination of brightness, because there's two other things you need to account for. One of which is the nonlinearity of computer screens, which tend to darken in the midtones. And this, there's something called the gamma correction constant, and there's been a lot of study on this that, for computer screens, generally it's 2.2 is the correction factor. I think for Macs, certain version of Macs, it's 1.8. But this has been studied in depth. And then there's a second one, which is spectral sensitivity of the human eye, which causes colors near the middle of the spectrum, so the greens, yellows, cyans, to appear brighter than the ones at the edges. And so you can adjust for that using numeric weighting of the RGB values. And we'll see that in the DAX that I'm about to show you. The final thing is that in the use of hex codes, there is a transparency option. So typically hex codes, hex meaning 6, are 6-character codes, but there's actually an 8-character hex code you can use with the double zeros at the end that will make that color fully transparent. And there's a lot of cool things you can do with that. And I've got right here kind of this layering approach where you can put visuals and then cards on top of visuals and then other clear transparent layers on top of those cards. And by switching the transparency masks, you can show and hide those visuals and do some neat stuff with the tooltips and the other visual attributes that I'll show you in the work that Pim and I put together. So why don't we jump out of here and jump right into Power BI, and we'll start with the dynamic font colors. Okay, so here we are in Power BI, and we're going to work on this dynamic font optimization issue. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take some theme files. And one of which that I actually like of the basic ones is this one called City Park. And we're going to take City Park and we're going to save the current theme. And let's just call that City Park theme. And the second one that we're going to be dealing with today is one that's colorblind safe. And we'll take that one and we'll save that one to the desktop as well. Okay, and now what we can do is, one of the things that I've found quite helpful in working with colors is to actually pull the JSON file from the theme into Power Query and create some tables of the hex codes. So we're going to do that. Get data. And it's going to be a JSON file. And let's find that on the desktop. Here we go, City Park theme. And we'll open that up. And what we see is it creates a nice table right off the bat of the theme name, the data colors, the background, the foreground, and the table accent. And so we can use all this in our DAX, in our dynamic font calculations. And so what I like to do with this is just to go through and to add a column, an index column, starting from 1. And this just gives a way to identify the individual colors in the data colors column. So I've already done this. Rather than have you watch me do this over and over again, I've got this for the City Park theme, and I've done the same thing for the colorblind safe theme. And what we can now do is we can take and append these together into just one file that I call themes. And this is basically, as you can see, this is just the City Park theme stacked on top of the colorblind safe theme. And so that's really all we need to do in Power Query for the moment. So let's close and apply out of this. And so now what we want to do is let's create a table of the hex codes that we've got in the different themes. And so we'll create the table here, and let's also create a slicer so we can switch between the color themes. So let's bring theme out here. And one of the reasons you may want to do this is I read what was for me a very influential article by Stephanie Evergreen a couple months ago about the typical red, yellow, green indicators that we use for sentiment and for conditional formatting. And one of the criticisms she had of that was that for people who are colorblind, those colors are a nightmare. They all look kind of brownish and they look the same. And so she recommended not using that theme. I find that it's such an instinctive thing for people that, red, yellow, green just instinctively means positive, neutral, negative to so many people that abandoning it entirely was just something I was hesitant to do. And so I thought, is there a way we can use that but still be fully accessible to people with the color blindness? And so what I thought about was, what about if we had a dynamically switchable theme? And so we can do this, and let's take this slicer and let's make it a single select so that we've got to pick one of the two themes. And this is one application of that. I think there's a number of others. One of them I was thinking about is you could use a similar approach for light and dark mode. I was actually out on the deck the other day working, and the sun was shining, and I thought, boy, it would be nice to have a switchable high and low contrast mode to make colors really jump out when you're out in the sun. So I think there's a lot of practical uses for this construct. But for now, let's think about it in terms of, kind of the traditional, red, yellow, green, and then a colorblind safe version of the same. So let's take our data colors and drop that into the table. And what we've also got is data colors, a copy of the same one. We'll see in a minute why that's going to be helpful. So same two fields, and let's conditionally format that data colors field for the background color. And we'll just do that using field value, kind of the simplest possible field value, which is just the data color field itself. And what we see there is, as we scroll down, we go from dark to light, and the dark ones are not really readable from a font standpoint because they're too dark, and then the light ones get better. And then if we switch to colorblind safe, we see kind of a mix here. Same thing, that the light colors are quite readable, the dark ones are not. So let's format the copy in the same way for the background color. And field value. Okay, so we've got that formatted the same way with background. But now let's go back to the DAX that we talked about originally in the color theory discussion. And to make this a little more visible, I'm going to pop open the great new DAX Editor Pro that Greg Deckler has developed and put that in dark mode. And we can take a look at the dynamic font DAX. And this originally looks pretty bad, in terms of what is it doing. It seems really complicated. But when we go back to the theory that we talked about, all it's really doing is it's grabbing the background color, and then it's taking the individual hex code values and converting those to RGB. It's correcting for that gamma exponent that we talked about for the distortion of the computer screen, normalizing the value from 1 to 255 to between 1 and 0, and then applying the gamma correction and the weighting for the mid-spectrum colors versus the outer spectrum colors. And what we get here is the kind of the binary determination of if luminescence is greater than 0.5 from all these calculations. So basically, if it's a lighter color, it gets a black font, and if it's a darker color, it gets a white font. So what we can do is use that dynamic color in that second column and see how that improves the visibility. And this obviously is the kind of thing you could never do in a rules structure or in the color gradient, that it's only the complexity afforded by doing the DAX field value that lets you do something like this. So if we go to data colors copy and we go conditional formatting and then font color, and really the power of field value is not just that you can use column fields, but that you can also use measure outcomes. And so if we go to key measures and dynamic font color and click OK, now we see something really cool, that it's basically figuring out the luminescence of the color and then using the binary determination for whether that gets a black or white font is more readable. And you can see just in the comparison, particularly as you get down into this darker range, that it's correctly figured out in all cases the proper font color to make that readable. And so I think that is just an incredibly cool application DAX and conditional formatting and field value. And what I want to do now is just take a quick look at, kind of why we think this is useful. So what I've got here is just a really basic example. It's kind of some mock data that I put together of kind of a hypothetical data challenge and the scoring results. And we just put that into a matrix with kind of your typical heat map, and we use the positive, negative, neutral, and then we've got it tied to the theme slicer that we talked about. And the only difference here is that I've got a little legend that is basically just a stripped down bar chart that has kind of a fixed height to the bars and is tied to that slicer as well. So particularly for the colorblind theme, you can tell what is negative, neutral, and positive. And the thing we can see here is that this looks like it works pretty well, with the exception of the fact that for this neutral color, it's really hard to read the numbers. And similarly on City Park, probably the red and maybe the green is a little too dark as well for the black. So why don't we take and apply our dynamic font color and see how that works in a conditional formatting approach. And this colorblind safe distinction that we talked about is one application. I could see another application being light versus dark mode, or even if you've got a situation where you're working outside on a laptop and you could have a high contrast and low contrast color scheme for outside versus inside. So I think a lot of different practical applications for this, but let's take a look now at our conditional formatting. And if we go here and apply conditional formatting to the font color and then tie that on field value to our dynamic font measure. Let's see how that works. And that now looks great. So what we're seeing is it's determined based on the luminescence that yellow gets black and everything else gets a white font. And that really does just jump off the page as clear. And then if we look at colorblind safe, same thing. So the two that were black before remain black, but now the neutral is quite readable with the white font. So that's our first application. Hopefully you can really see the power of combining DAX and conditional formatting in that. And now I want to move into custom icons and show you some tricks there where you can really expand the set of icons that are usable in conditional formatting. So if we look in Power BI at icons and we take a look at the icon sets, what we see is they're okay. They're utilitarian, but they're pretty limited. And there are some of these, definitely these framed ones that I don't think look that good. I wouldn't use. So it's really a pretty limited set. And when you really look at the world of icons out there, sites like Flat Icon that have, I think, 4 million icons, available. That the Numero toolkit has a great set of black and white icons that you can use for free. And there's whole bunches of great sets out there. And so why kind of be bound by the couple of dozen icon sets in the rules-based formatting? So what we can do is we can take a look at our theme. And this is the City Park theme that we started with in the dynamic font formatting. And this is just kind of the bare bones theme with just the name and the data colors. And when I referenced the work by Dhruvan Shah, one of the things that he did in his video was added in a separate section into the JSON file with custom icons. And this is kind of the skeleton version of what that section looks like. It's not completed yet because we've actually got to include the icons here. But this is the general structure. And so what we've got is we've got 3 icons that we want to we want to include. And we want to use cloudy, stormy, and sunny for this is positive, negative, and neutral. And I don't know whether you would use these in a business context, but I thought they were nice looking icons. And I just wanted to show something that would be outside the realm of what would be in the traditional rules-based formatting set. And then this trophy icon will also pull in. But basically you can use whatever business icons or even something, a little more out of the box like this. But you're basically not bound by any constraints anymore in this. So what we do is, in order to bring these icons in, they have to be in base 64. So there are a whole bunch of base 64 converters online. I happen to like this one, the base 64-image.de, for a number of reasons. It's got a nice optimization here that will cut down the file size without noticeable decrease in quality. And it's got kind of a nice drag and drop interface. So what we can do is we can take those icons and let's grab all 4 of these and just drag those right out of here. And what you see is it rapidly processes these. And if you want to take a look at the code, it's basically just converts those to text. And what we can do is we can take each of these and copy the image. So sunny is our positive. And if we go to that skeleton that we just take and we insert that here and hit paste, and we just go through and do that for all 3. We're actually going to save the trophy icon for later for something else. But basically, if we fill those in, we get this completed template with the base 64. And so what we can do with that is now we can do 2 things with that. One of which is we can pull that in directly as our theme. And so if we go into Power BI and we hit View and Browse for Themes, Browse for Themes, and then we look for that. We look for that theme in our folder. Here we go. City Park theme with weather icons. And it was imported successfully. And now if we go in here, and what I've got is just a table with that same challenge rating data that we had before, just in table form. And if we go to total score and conditional formatting and now icons, what we'll see if we drop this down is we've now got stormy, sunny, cloudy available within the icon set. And so we can do this as rules, but as you probably guessed, I prefer to do it as DAX field value. And so what we can do is we can take this, and I've got a measure which is icons. Oh, actually, before we do that, what we need to do is we need to bring this theme with the weather icons into Power Query, because there's a table we're going to need to create that we need to use. So let's go to transform, and we'll bring that theme in. I've already done that. So this is the City Park with weather icons, and we just pull it in as a JSON file. It converts to a table. We can take out all these data colors and table accent fields, because all we really care about is what's here in the icon field. So we go down, we remove those columns, we expand out all 3 of these icon fields. So we jump down here. Now we've got all of those expanded, And now what we can do is we can take and unpivot that data. So we unpivot and we end up with two columns. And what we want to do out of here in the attribute is just pull the middle part, the name, out of that. So we're gonna split column by delimiter, and then we're just going to remove those other junk columns on the either side of the delimiter. So we're left with the name. And now what we need to do is we need to take this values column and we need to pivot that into two columns. So one which is a sentiment, negative, positive, and neutral, and the other which is the actual URL. And the way we do that is through a neat trick. So we add an index, and then there's a function called modulo. And I've done a video on this before, but if you haven't seen that or don't remember it, what we do is basically we use this modulo calculation. And what that does is, if we go back to index and we say transform, we pick the index field and then we pick modulo. What that'll do is, here we can actually pop this without inserting a step. So what it'll do is you pick a value and it'll divide the index by that value and give you the remainder. And so what modulo does in this case is we want to take that index and we want to turn it from a consecutive string into this repeating 0, 1, 0, 1. And so if you see the way it works is we've got 0, 1, 2, and now we change it to modulo 2, and we have that repeating pattern. And now what we can do is we can pivot based on that column. And here's the 0 column, which becomes our sentiment, and the 1 column, which becomes our image URL, our icon URL. And we just change the types and we're good to go. So we've now got this icon table that we can reference in our DAX measures. And so let's close out of this and let's take a look at those measures. So now what we've got is we've got our conditional formatting icons field value. And what we're doing is we're saying, okay, for a score greater than or equal to 8, we're basically querying that icons, we're filtering that icons table such that the sentiment is positive. And then we're doing the same thing. We're changing the filter context for the table so that it's between 6 and 8. So that gets a neutral, and then negative gets below 6. And what we do here is we just add the has one value just so that we don't end up with an icon on the total field. And so by doing that and making sure when we do this to make sure that it's flagged as an image URL. Otherwise, it's just going to give you the URL text. And so what we can do is we can take this and drag this over here, and then we can, if we don't want this long label, we just put a space in, and we've now got our icons. Now you may be thinking, okay, what's the value of that given the fact that we could have just done that by rules? And you would be right in the sense that you could have just as easily done that one by rules. But what about if instead of just doing a kind of a simple partitioning of the scores, saying 8 and above gets the positive, 7 or 6 or 7 gets the neutral, and below 6 gets the negative. What if we wanted to do a more sophisticated rule, which said that we wanted to base it on averages? And so we want to take for any given pillar, we wanted to take the average score of that pillar and say if you were 1 point or above that average, that would be a positive. Within that 1 point range of the average would be a neutral, and then below that average score would be a negative. That's, again, the kind of thing you can't do within rules, but within field value, you absolutely can. And it becomes quite easy to do. So all you really need to do here is, again, a simple switch statement where we've got an average score measure, which is just the average over all the names for that given pillar. And then if we look at it, all we're doing is we're basically saying if it's less than the average score, it gets a negative. If it's less than the average score plus 1, it gets a neutral. And then greater than that gets a positive. And again, we wrap it in the has one value to avoid the icon with the sum total. So again, there's something that you couldn't do by rules, but that becomes quite easy to do by DAX. And I put this all together before the new field parameter, and so my guess is that there's probably an even easier way to implement that using field parameters. But even that is just a pretty straightforward switch statement. And then what we can do here is we can do a little bit more with our high score. And this is basically just looking at the value of the scores and the total score, figuring out what the max is, and then allowing for the fact that more than one person can have a max score. And so what we do is use the concatenate-x unicar 10 trick that I like so much in terms of taking what would be a table result and producing that as a measure with just that unicar hard return. And so I know I'm moving kind of quick through this because we've got to get to the third example, but this just, again, shows you what you can do with these custom icons in terms of taking that high score and then taking this trophy icon, which again is just a base 64 conversion. And we just basically set the icon equal to that base 64, and then we can just drop that into a one cell table. So it gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of what we can do with those custom icons. So that again opens the door wide for you for basically any sort of icon sets that match your corporate theme or match your navigational theme. So that's custom icons, and now I want to move into the final example, which is the visual layering and transparency. So this is a problem that originally came to me in the Enterprise DNA forum. And what the questioner wanted to do was they had a chart and they wanted to test whether or not there were sufficient observations available to do the calculation that they were basing the chart on. So what they decided was that 16 observations was the threshold, that at 16 or below, it would not produce reliable and valid results. So they wanted to show the chart if they had more than 16 observations and have basically a warning message that there were insufficient observations if they had less than 16. And so the way I handled this in the first iteration was kind of through a relatively simple two-layering approach on the visuals. And going back to that earlier discussion we had about transparency masks, that in the hex code, putting those double zeros at the end and making the color transparent allows you to manipulate these layers. And so what I did was the bottom layer was the chart itself. The blue-green was the chart. And then on top of that, what I did is placed just a simple card that had this warning message in it. And then turned that card either transparent or not, and then also changed the font color to transparent or not, based on whether you were above or below that slider threshold. And so if you look here, at conditional formatting background. It's just a simple if statement that if it's greater than 16, then you turn this card transparent, and if it's not, you keep it white. And similarly with the font, same thing. That if it's above 16, the font gets made transparent, and if not, then you go with this red text. And so it's a pretty simple technique. I think pretty useful in terms of kind of extending that conditional formatting through the field value approaches we've been talking about. But the interesting thing is, I got a message from Pim Meesters, as I mentioned, young developer in the Netherlands, and he had a good comment that he said it's a cool technique, but it doesn't allow you to produce tooltips even when you're above the threshold. And he's absolutely right that the card blocks the tooltips and actually sometimes gives you just an echoing of that message at the wrong time. So I thought about this and I responded to him. I said, it's a really good point. Let me think about it, and I think there's a way to fix it. And so he said he would work on it, I would work on it, and we'd come back together in a couple of days and see where we were. So the second iteration, what I did is I put a third layer on top, which was basically the chart, then the card, then a transparent third layer, which was a copy of the original chart, but just with everything turned transparent. So that what you could do is it would mimic the chart on the bottom, but then it would provide tooltips. And so you would have the tooltip, the transparent version above the card, so providing tooltips through that copy of the chart. And that worked pretty well. That was, I think, a pretty good solution. But the problem with that one, so we got the desired visual effect, and tooltips were now available. So definitely a better solution than the initial one. The problem with it was that when you got below the threshold, tooltips were still there because this layer still exists and is active, this top layer. And so, it might be unlikely that if you've got a message like this, people are going to be mousing over it. But if they do, you definitely don't want them to see this sort of tooltip. So then Pim came back to me and said he had a different solution, in a way much simpler. So what he did is he took the layering apart and built everything on conditional formatting based on conditional titles and then also conditional measure on the total sales. And I'll show you how this works. So what he did was on the chart title and the chart title background, he just had, again, if it was above the threshold, he had the regular title, and then below the threshold, he used that as the warning message. So very clever approach. The nice thing about it is he combined it with a conditional total sales measure, so that if you were above the threshold, you got total sales just as regular sum of line sales. But if you were below, you got blank. And the cool thing about that is that when all of your observations are blank, your whole chart becomes blank. That it doesn't produce the axes and the labels. It just blanks the whole thing. So no need to even make additional measures to do that. That once you're below the threshold, that total sales conditional measure basically controlled this whole bottom portion of the chart. And so nice, elegant solution, quite simple. The problem is we didn't really like the visual effect, that it left, kind of a big gap here, and you had to kind of understand that the title then became the warning message. And that, for people not used to Power BI, might not be a good UX choice. So what we did is we put our heads together on the three options that we laid out before. And what we found was that if you combined the second iteration layering with the conditional sales measure, that actually works perfectly. And what you get is you get the visual effect that you want, and then you get no tooltips here, because what's happened is when you slide the slider below the threshold, this total sales conditional measure kicks in and blanks out all the observations. So really, other than the fact that it requires some layering, we really felt this was the optimal solution. And it just, again, kind of proves my point from early on that, putting your work out there and working in community really is a benefit. It's a benefit for challenges, but it's also a benefit just for kind of conceptual work that you're doing, that I would not probably have come to this solution, or certainly come to it as quickly, without basically working together with Pim and bouncing ideas off of each other. And so, one of the things in the member case study session that I did a couple of days ago, one of the members talked about, kind of the value of putting your work out there publicly. And that's something I just really wanted to reiterate. I think it really helped in this case. And so what I'm hoping is you found some useful techniques here, but even if these specific techniques are not ones that you could see yourself using, what I'm hoping is that it really underscored the point that field value in the use of DAX really is that force multiplier for conditional formatting. And you're really limited only by your imagination in terms of what you can apply in conditional formatting when you've got the full power of DAX behind you. So that's all I wanted to cover today. I hope you enjoyed that, got something useful out of it. And at this point, I think we've got time for a few questions. So I'm happy to do that and take those questions. And enjoy the rest of your